The storm had been raging across Kepler Station for 3 standard days, and Marcus Chen was beginning to think his little bar might actually blow away into the void. The Drifter's Rest wasn't much to look at even on good days. A converted cargo container bolted to the outer ring of the station, with mismatched furniture and a ventilation system that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs. But it was his, and more importantly, it was the only place on this forgotten corner of space where beings could drink without worrying about their species, their past, or their unpaid debts. Marcus wiped down the bar for the 100th time that evening, listening to the hull groan against the electromagnetic tempest outside. The few regulars who'd braved the storm sat hunched over their drinks, speaking in low voices about shipping delays and credit shortages. A Centaurian trader named Veltar was arguing with his business partner about rerouting their cargo through the Vega system. 2 human miners from the asteroid belt were playing cards and complaining about their supervisor, nothing unusual for a Tuesday night on the edge of nowhere. The door chimed, followed by a rush of cold air that made everyone look up. What stumbled through the entrance wasn't like anything Marcus had seen before, and in 15 years of running a bar on a frontier station, he'd seen some strange things. The creature was tall, maybe 7 feet, with a humanoid torso covered in what looked like golden-brown feathers that seemed to shimmer despite being soaked with condensation. Its arms ended in hands that were too long and graceful, with fingers that moved like they were designed for something more delicate than most species ever attempted. But it was the way it held itself that caught Marcus's attention. Hunched and trying to hide what were, obviously, wings folded against its back, the creature limped to the farthest corner booth, the one Marcus kept reserved for customers who needed privacy. As it moved, Marcus caught glimpses of those wings, magnificent things that would probably span 20 feet when extended, with feathers that shifted from gold to deep amber in the shifting light. The creature's face was sharp-featured and elegant, with large eyes that held an intelligence that seemed ancient. Those eyes darted around the room like it was expecting trouble. Marcus had seen that look before. It was the look of someone running from something, someone who'd been hurt and didn't know who to trust. He'd seen it in the mirror often enough during his own darker days. The creature settled into the booth and tried to make itself smaller, which was quite a feat for something of its size. Marcus noticed how it positioned itself, so it could see both the main entrance and the emergency exit, how its hands never strayed far from what might have been weapons hidden beneath the traveling cloak it wore. Professional paranoia, the kind that came from experience. Marcus grabbed a clean glass and filled it with water, then walked over to the booth. The creature tensed as he approached, those large eyes focusing on him with laser intensity. Up close, Marcus could see the exhaustion in its face, the way its feathers were dulled with fatigue and stress. There were also marks on its neck that looked suspiciously like restraint burns. "Evening," Marcus said, setting the water down on the table. "Welcome to the Drifter's Rest. You look like you could use this." The creature stared at the glass for a long moment, then up at Marcus. When it spoke, its voice was melodious but carried an odd accent, like someone who'd learned standard from old recordings. "I have no credits for payment." Marcus shrugged. "Did I ask for any?" "It's water. Nobody charges for water on my watch." He gestured to the booth. "Mind if I sit? Standing too long plays hell with my back." The creature's head tilted slightly, a gesture that reminded Marcus of a bird trying to figure out if something was a threat. After a moment, it nodded. Marcus slid into the opposite side of the booth, careful to keep his hands visible and his posture relaxed. "Marcus Chen," he said, extending a hand. "I own this place." The creature looked at his outstretched hand like it was some alien artifact, then slowly reached out and clasped it with those elegant fingers. Its grip was surprisingly gentle for something with such obvious strength. "I am," it paused, as if trying to decide what name to give. "Zephyr will suffice." "Zephyr," Marcus repeated, filing away the hesitation for later consideration. "That's a good name. Greek origin, if I remember right, means gentle breeze." He smiled. "Though you look like you've been through more than a gentle breeze lately." Zephyr's laugh was bitter. "You could say that." Marcus waited, letting the silence stretch. It was an old bartender's trick. Sometimes people needed space to decide whether they wanted to talk. He watched Zephyr drink the water slowly, as if savoring every drop. The creature's table manners were impeccable, the kind of precise movements that spoke of formal training or noble birth. That was interesting. "I should not be here," Zephyr said finally. "It is dangerous for anyone to be seen helping me." "Dangerous how?" Marcus asked. "And to who?" Zephyr's eyes darted around the bar again. "There are those who would pay handsomely for information about my whereabouts. I am wanted by certain parties." "What kind of certain parties?" The kind that employ professional hunters and have very long memories. Zephyr's voice dropped barely above a whisper. I am the last of my kind in this sector. Perhaps in the galaxy. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard stories about species hunters, criminals who specialized in capturing rare or extinct beings for private collectors or illegal research. It was one of the most despicable trades in known space, and unfortunately one of the most profitable. What kind are you exactly? Marcus asked carefully, if you don't mind me asking. Zephyr was quiet for so long that Marcus began to think the question wouldn't be answered. Then, slowly, the creature reached up and pulled back the hood of its cloak. What Marcus saw made him forget to breathe. The face was beautiful in an otherworldly way, with features that seemed carved from precious metal, but it was what crowned that face that made Marcus's heart race, a magnificent crest of feathers that caught the bar's dim light and seemed to glow with their own inner fire. The feathers were every shade of gold and amber, with hints of deep red that looked like captured sunset. My people called themselves the Aethon, Zephyr said quietly, though most species knew us by another name. Marcus's mouth went dry. Griffins, he whispered. Zephyr nodded. The humans have stories about us, do they not? Old myths from your homeworld? More than stories, Marcus managed. Legends. We thought everyone thinks you're extinct, have been for centuries. Not extinct, Zephyr corrected. Hunted. Captured. Sold. My people were prizes for those wealthy enough to afford them. We were displayed in private collections, forced to perform in illegal fighting rings, experimented upon by researchers who wanted to unlock the secrets of our longevity and abilities. The golden eyes hardened. Very few of us remained free. Marcus felt anger building in his chest, the slow burn that had gotten him in trouble more than once in his younger days. That's why you're running. I escaped from a collector 3 cycles ago, Zephyr said. He had held me for longer than I care to remember. I have been moving ever since, trying to stay ahead of his hunters. But I am tired, and I made a mistake coming here. Stations like this have too many eyes, too many people willing to sell information for the right price. Marcus looked around his bar, seeing it suddenly through different eyes. Veltar the trader, who always seemed to know more than he let on. The 2 miners who'd been asking an awful lot of questions about recent arrivals. Even old Pete, the drunk in the corner who everyone ignored. Any of them could be gathering information for the right buyer. How long since you've had a real meal? Marcus asked. The question seemed to surprise Zephyr. What? Food. When did you last eat something that wasn't ration bars or whatever you could steal? Zephyr's composure cracked slightly. I do not remember. Marcus stood up. Stay here. Don't go anywhere. He walked back to the kitchen, a cramped space behind the bar that was barely big enough for one person. Marcus wasn't much of a cook, but he knew his way around comfort food. He pulled ingredients from his personal stash, real beef, not the synthetic stuff, vegetables from the hydroponic gardens, spices that cost more than most people made in a week. If you were going to help someone, he'd always believed, you might as well do it right. While the food cooked, Marcus thought about what he'd learned. Griffins were real, or at least this one was. The implications made his head spin. The mythology of his own species had always described griffins as noble creatures, guardians of ancient treasures and symbols of divine justice. But seeing Zephyr hunched in that booth, exhausted and afraid, all Marcus could see was someone who needed help. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. Marcus finished cooking and loaded a plate with more food than any normal being could eat in one sitting. He grabbed a bottle of his best whiskey and 2 glasses, then returned to the booth. Zephyr looked up as he approached, eyes widening at the sight of the meal. I told you I cannot pay, and I told you I wasn't asking for payment, Marcus interrupted, setting the plate down. This is what we call hospitality where I come from. Someone shows up at your door hungry and tired, you feed them. No questions asked, no payment required. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey and slid one across the table. This, on the other hand, you're definitely paying for. But lucky for you, the price isn't money. Zephyr picked up the glass and sniffed it cautiously. What is the price? Marcus raised his own glass. Your story. The real one. All of it. Zephyr stared at him for a long moment, then slowly lifted the glass. You may regret making that bargain, Marcus Chen. Maybe, Marcus agreed. But I've made worse deals with better information. Besides, something tells me your story's worth more than whatever I've got in this bottle. They drank, and Marcus watched as the fine whiskey brought the first real expression of pleasure he'd seen on Zephyr's face. The Griffin, and Marcus was still trying to wrap his mind around that, closed those golden eyes and seemed to savor the burn of good alcohol. "Where should I begin?" Zephyr asked finally. "Beginning's usually a good place," Marcus said. "But start wherever feels right. We've got all night." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the Drifter's Rest, in a corner booth lit by warm amber light, two very different beings began to share a story that would change the course of galactic history. Marcus Chen, former cargo hauler turned bartender, had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to wake something that had been sleeping in the galaxy for 1,000 years. All he knew was that someone needed help, and helping was what humans did best. Zephyr began to speak, and Marcus listened, occasionally refilling their glasses as the tale unfolded. It was a story of ancient courts among the stars, of a proud people brought low by greed and cruelty, of bonds broken and trust shattered. It was also a story of hope, carefully guarded and jealously protected, carried by the few survivors who still believed their people could be something more than prizes in a collector's menagerie. As the night wore on and the storm finally began to subside, Marcus found himself understanding that he'd stumbled into something much larger than a simple refugee situation. Zephyr wasn't just the last of an extinct species. The Griffin was a key to something that had been lost, something that certain powerful people would kill to possess and others would die to protect. But all of that was still in the future. For now, there was just two beings sharing food and drink and stories, proving once again that the best things in the universe often began with the simplest gestures of kindness. The morning shift change brought new faces to the Drifter's Rest, and Marcus watched each arrival with heightened awareness. Zephyr had spent the night in the storage room behind the bar, curled up on an old cargo blanket with a piece Marcus hadn't seen during their initial meeting. The Griffin slept like someone who hadn't felt safe in a very long time, wings tucked tight against the elegant form and one hand resting near what Marcus now knew was a plasma blade of unusual design. During their long conversation the previous night, Zephyr had shared fragments of a history that read like something from humanity's oldest myths. The Aethon had once ruled a confederation of star systems, serving as mediators between species and guardians of ancient knowledge. They lived for millennia, their memories spanning generations of other races. Their ships rode solar winds between galaxies, and their cities floated in the coronas of stars, powered by energies that modern science barely understood. Then came the collectors. It started small, as most evil things did. A few Aethon captured during exploration missions, sold to private menageries as exotic curiosities. The Griffin nobility dismissed these incidents as unfortunate but isolated events. They were wrong. Within a century, organized hunting parties were raiding Aethon settlements. The species' longevity, intelligence, and beauty made them incredibly valuable on the black market. Worse, their natural ability to navigate hyperspace without technological assistance made them prized as living navigational computers for criminal organizations. The Aethon Council had tried to fight back, but they were scholars and mediators, not warriors. Their weapons were designed for precision, not mass destruction. Their ships prioritized speed and elegance over armor and firepower. Most damaging of all, their culture valued individual freedom so highly that organizing a coordinated military response was nearly impossible. One by one, the great Ares fell. Aethon Prime, with its crystalline spires reaching toward the stars, was the last to be taken. Zephyr had been there, a young courier carrying messages between the scattered survivors. The Griffin had watched from a distant moon as hunter ships surrounded the homeworld, had seen the great shields fail as the planet's defenders were overwhelmed. That was 300 years ago. Since then, Zephyr had been one of perhaps a dozen free Aethon remaining in known space, constantly moving, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments or leave traces. It was a lonely existence that had slowly eroded the Griffin's connection to the ancient culture and traditions of their people. Marcus had listened to all of this while refilling glasses and occasionally asking questions that helped fill in gaps in the story. What struck him most wasn't the tragedy of a fallen civilization. Space was full of those. It was the way Zephyr spoke about the loss of community, the slow forgetting of songs and stories that had been passed down for millennia. The Griffin wasn't just a refugee from physical bondage, but from cultural extinction. The worst part, Zephyr had said as dawn light began to filter through the bar's small windows, is not the hunting or the capture, it is the forgetting. Each day I remain alone, I lose a little more of what it means to be Aethon. Our knowledge was stored in living memory, passed from elder to youngling through direct neural connection. Without others of my kind, I am watching my heritage die in real time. Now, watching the Griffins sleep in the back room, Marcus found himself thinking about that loss. Humans understood the importance of cultural preservation. They'd carried their stories and songs and traditions across the galaxy, adapting them to new worlds while maintaining their essential character. The idea of watching all of that simply fade away because you were the last one left to remember it was heartbreaking. The morning crowd was different from the night shift regulars. These were traders and merchants preparing for the post-storm departure rush, station workers grabbing coffee before their shifts, and the occasional traveler looking for a quick meal. Marcus served them all while keeping one eye on the storage room door and another on the main entrance. It was around mid-morning when trouble arrived. Marcus spotted them the moment they walked in. Two beings who moved with the predatory grace of professional hunters. The first was Calixian, reptilian features hidden behind expensive optical enhancements that probably included thermal and electromagnetic scanners. The second looked human, but something about the way he held himself suggested extensive cybernetic modification. Both wore the kind of casual clothing that cost more than most people made in a month, and both had the unmistakable bulge of concealed weapons. They took a table near the center of the room, ordered expensive drinks, and began the careful process of scanning every other customer in the bar. Marcus had seen this routine before. They were hunters, and they were looking for someone specific. Marcus continued his morning routine, cleaning glasses and restocking bottles while his mind raced. There was no way these two had arrived by coincidence the morning after Zephyr's appearance. Someone had talked or someone had been tracking the Griffin more closely than either of them had realized. The Calixian was showing his companion something on a small display device, probably a capture notice or bounty posting. Marcus couldn't see the details, but he recognized the gesture. They knew who they were looking for. Marcus made his decision. He walked over to their table with practiced casual ease, carrying a bottle of the same expensive whiskey he'd shared with Zephyr. "Gentlemen, I couldn't help but notice you're drinking the premium stuff. Mind if I join you? Always like to meet customers with good taste." The human looked up with eyes that were definitely augmented, irises showing the telltale shimmer of enhanced optics. "We're actually here on business." "What kind of business?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. The Calixian spoke in the hissing accent of his species. "We are looking for someone, a rare individual who may have passed through this establishment recently." Marcus poured himself a drink and settled into an empty chair. "Lots of people pass through here. You might need to be more specific." The human activated his display and turned it so Marcus could see the screen. The image showed a perfect three-dimensional representation of Zephyr, captured with the kind of detail that could only come from high-end surveillance equipment. Below the image was text in several languages, including standard, "Wanted alive, substantial reward." "Have you seen this individual?" the Calixian asked. Marcus studied the image carefully, letting his expression show recognition. "Yeah, I've seen them. Came through about a week ago, I think. Bought a few drinks, asked about transport options. Seemed pretty nervous about something." The hunters exchanged glances. "Did they say where they were going?" the human pressed. "Mentioned something about the outer colonies," Marcus lied smoothly. "Said something about having friends in the Tau Ceti system. Bought passage on a freight hauler, if I remember right." This was exactly what the hunters wanted to hear. The Tau Ceti system was 3 jumps away and notorious for its lack of extradition treaties. It was the kind of place someone would go to disappear, and it would take the hunters at least a week to get there and confirm the lead was false. "Which freight company?" the Calixian demanded. Marcus pretended to think. "Morrison Interstellar, I think. They run weekly routes to that sector." He paused, then added the kind of detail that would make the story believable. "Your friends seem pretty desperate. Paid for passage in raw metals instead of credits. Had a case of refined platinum that probably cost more than my bar is worth." The human was already standing. "We need to check the departure logs. Station administrative office is on level 7, Marcus offered helpfully. "They'll have all the shipping manifests." After they left, Marcus waited exactly 30 seconds before walking to the storage room. He knocked softly on the door. "Zephyr, we need to talk." The Griffin emerged, looking alert despite having slept for only a few hours. Those golden eyes immediately focused on Marcus's face, reading the tension there with disturbing accuracy. "They found me," Zephyr said. It wasn't a question. 2 hunters just left. Professional-grade equipment, enough credits to buy passage on any ship in the port. Marcus kept his voice low. "I bought us some time by sending them toward Tau Ceti, but they'll figure out the deception eventually." Zephyr's shoulders sagged. "How long do we have?" "Maybe a week, if we're lucky. Less if they're smarter than they looked." Marcus paused. "Of course, there's another option." "Which is?" We don't run. Zephyr stared at him. I do not understand. Marcus had been thinking about this since the moment he'd seen the bounty notice. The reward amount was substantial enough to buy a small fleet of ships, which meant whoever wanted Zephyr back was serious about getting them. But it also meant there were resources available that could be turned to other purposes. Tell me about the other survivors, Marcus said. The free ones. How do you contact them? We do not contact each other, Zephyr replied immediately. I would be so happy. It is too dangerous. Any communication can be traced, any meeting place can be compromised, but you know they exist. I sense them sometimes. When I meditate deeply, I can feel echoes of other Aethon minds, but the connections are faint, and I cannot determine locations or even exact numbers. Marcus nodded. What would happen if you could reach them? If there was a safe way to bring the survivors together? Zephyr's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The neural networks could be reestablished. Our cultural memories could be preserved and shared. We could begin to rebuild our knowledge base. The Griffin paused, but such a thing is impossible. The hunters would detect any gathering long before it could accomplish anything meaningful. Not necessarily, Marcus said. What if the gathering wasn't on some remote planet where strangers would stand out? What if it happened somewhere that already attracted beings from every species in the galaxy? Somewhere with enough traffic that a few more unusual visitors wouldn't be noticed? You are suggesting that other Aethon come here? To this station? Zephyr's voice carried disbelief. The risk would be enormous. The risk of doing nothing is worse, Marcus pointed out. You said it yourself. Every day you spend alone, you lose more of your cultural heritage. How long before there's nothing left to save? Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, golden eyes distant, as the Griffin considered possibilities and dangers. Even if the others could be contacted, even if they agreed to come, the hunters would eventually follow them here. We would be trapped. Maybe, Marcus agreed. Or maybe we spring the trap ourselves, on our terms. What do you mean? Marcus smiled, and there was something in that expression that reminded Zephyr of why humans had managed to spread across the galaxy despite being one of the younger species. It was the look of someone who had just figured out how to turn a bad situation to their advantage. I mean, we stop running and start hunting the hunters. The plan that Marcus outlined over the next hour was audacious to the point of insanity, but it had one crucial advantage. Nobody would expect it. Instead of hiding from the criminal networks that had been hunting Aethon for centuries, they would draw those networks into a confrontation where the Griffins held the advantages. The Drifter's Rest would become bait. Marcus would put out word through carefully selected channels that a rare creature had taken up residence in his bar, offering its services as a navigator for the right price. The story would be crafted to sound like the Griffin was desperate enough to risk exposure for steady credits. Meanwhile, Zephyr would attempt to reach other survivors using ancient techniques that Marcus barely understood, but which sounded like a combination of meditation and quantum entanglement. If other Aethon could be convinced to come to Kepler Station, they would arrive to find not just a reunion, but a carefully prepared battlefield where their hunters would be the ones caught off guard. It was dangerous, complicated, and relied on too many variables that couldn't be controlled. It was also the first plan Zephyr had heard in 3 centuries that offered something more than endless running. There is something you must understand, Zephyr said as they finalized the details. The techniques required to contact my people, the methods we will need to coordinate their arrival, these things will leave traces, psychic echoes that certain individuals can detect and track. What kind of individuals? The original architects of our downfall. There are beings in this galaxy who have made the study and capture of Aethon their life's work. They have resources and knowledge that make ordinary hunters look like amateurs. Zephyr's voice dropped. If we attempt this, we will draw their attention. All of their attention. Marcus considered this new information. The stakes kept getting higher, but that didn't change the fundamental equation. How many Aethon do you think are still free? Perhaps a dozen, maybe fewer. And how many are already in captivity? Zephyr's expression grew pained. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. Marcus nodded slowly. Then we're not just talking about saving the ones who are free. We're talking about a chance to rescue the ones who aren't. The full implications of what Marcus was suggesting hit Zephyr like a physical blow. The human wasn't just proposing to save the Aethon species. He was talking about liberating every captured Griffin in known space. It would mean declaring war on some of the most powerful criminal organizations in the galaxy. You do not understand what you are suggesting, Zephyr whispered. Maybe not, Marcus admitted. But I understand this. Sometimes you have to stop running and make a stand. Sometimes you have to risk everything to save what really matters. He met Zephyr's golden gaze. Your people were guardians once, protectors, mediators who helped maintain peace between species. Maybe it's time for them to be those things again. Outside the bar, Marcus could hear the normal sounds of station life resuming after the storm. Ships were powering up for departure, cargo was being moved through the corridors, and thousands of beings were going about their daily lives without any idea that their universe was about to change. In a storage room behind a rundown bar, two very different beings were planning something that would reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. They were about to prove that humans and griffins shared more than ancient mythology. They shared an unwillingness to back down when something important was at stake. The hunt for the last free Aethon was about to become something very different. Instead of hunters pursuing prey, it would become a battle between those who saw intelligent beings as property to be owned and those who believed that freedom was worth any price. Marcus Chen, bartender and former cargo hauler, was about to start a war, and for the first time in his life, he was absolutely certain he was doing the right thing. 3 days after the hunter's visit, Marcus discovered that news traveled faster than he'd anticipated. The Drifter's Rest had become the subject of whispered conversations throughout the station, and not all of the attention was welcome. Word about the Navigator for Hire had spread through channels he hadn't intended to access, drawing interest from parties he definitely hadn't meant to attract. The first sign of trouble came in the form of Garrick Voss, a station security officer with expensive tastes and flexible ethics. Voss had always been willing to look the other way for the right price, but he'd never been stupid enough to get directly involved in anything that might draw heat from off-station authorities. His presence at Marcus's bar during the usually quiet afternoon shift was therefore cause for concern. "Heard you've got some unusual help around here these days," Voss said, settling onto a bar stool with the careful movements of someone carrying multiple concealed weapons. "The kind that might be of interest to certain governmental agencies," Marcus continued, polishing glasses, keeping his expression neutral. "Not sure what you mean, Garrick." "Same old crowd as always." "Come on, Marcus. Everyone knows you've got a Griffin working the back rooms. Word is they're selling navigation services to anyone with enough credits." Voss leaned forward conspiratorially. "Problem is, some of my contacts in the Colonial Authority are very interested in having a conversation with your new employee." "Something about unauthorized settlement of protected species." The Colonial Authority was bad news. Unlike the private hunters, government agents had legal authority to seize individuals and property without warrants or explanations. If they decided Zephyr was a protected species living in violation of settlement laws, they could confiscate the Griffin indefinitely while the paperwork sorted itself out, which meant years or decades of bureaucratic imprisonment while officials decided what to do with the last free Aethon. "How much?" Marcus asked quietly. Voss smiled. 20,000 standard, and that's just for a 24-hour delay in filing my report. After that, you're on your own. It was extortion, plain and simple, but Marcus had expected as much. He'd dealt with corrupt officials before, and the price wasn't unreasonable considering what was at stake. The problem was that paying Voss would only delay the inevitable. Once the Colonial Authority knew about Zephyr, they would keep applying pressure until they got what they wanted. "I'll have your money tonight," Marcus said. "But I need something in return." "You're not really in a position to negotiate." "Sure I am. You need this to look legitimate, which means you need time to create a paper trail that explains how you discovered the Griffin's presence. Rush the process, and someone might ask uncomfortable questions about your sources." Marcus set down the glass he'd been polishing. "I want to know who else is asking questions." "Who else knows?" Voss considered this. 3 different parties have made inquiries through official channels in the past 2 days. Colonial Authority, like I mentioned. Corporate security from something called Meridian Acquisitions. That's probably private collectors. And he paused, looking genuinely uncomfortable. Imperial Intelligence. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. Imperial Intelligence meant the Alterian Empire, and the Alterians didn't make inquiries about individuals unless those individuals represented potential threats to Imperial security. The Alterian Empire controlled 60 star systems and had military technology that made most other species look like they were still throwing rocks at each other. "What does Imperial Intelligence want with a Griffin?" "Above my pay grade," Voss said, "but the inquiry mentioned something about strategic navigation assets and ancient star chart databases. Whatever that means, they consider it worth sending a full diplomatic team to investigate." This was spiraling out of control faster than Marcus had anticipated. He'd expected private hunters and maybe some low-level government interest. He hadn't considered the possibility that someone would connect Zephyr to the ancient Aethon knowledge of hyperspace navigation routes. If the Altarian Empire believed they could extract strategic information from Zephyr, they would stop at nothing to acquire the Griffin. "How long before the Imperial team arrives?" Marcus asked. "Transport's already en route. Maybe 3 days, depending on hyperspace conditions." Marcus paid Voss's 20,000 credits and watched the corrupt officer leave, knowing that the money would buy them very little time. The situation had moved beyond what he and Zephyr could handle alone. It was time to accelerate their timeline, regardless of the risks involved. That evening, after closing the bar to regular customers, Marcus found Zephyr in what had become the Griffin's meditation space, a small storage room that Marcus had cleared of everything except a simple mat and a few harmonic crystals that Zephyr claimed helped focus mental energy. The Griffin sat in a position that would have been uncomfortable for most humanoids, wings folded precisely and those golden eyes closed in deep concentration. "We're out of time," Marcus said without preamble. "The big players know you're here, and they're sending teams to collect you." Zephyr's eyes opened, immediately alert. "How long?" 3 days, maybe less. "Imperial intelligence is en route, along with at least 2 other interested parties," said Marcus, settled into a chair across from the Griffin. "Whatever you're going to try, it has to be now." Zephyr nodded slowly. "I have been attempting the deep reach for the past 2 days. The process is difficult when performed alone. Normally, such communication would require a circle of at least 3 Aethon to generate sufficient psychic resonance, but you've made contact? Echoes. Fragments of familiar mental signatures." Zephyr's voice carried frustration. "I can sense my people, but I cannot establish coherent communication. It is like hearing voices through thick walls. I know they are there, but I cannot make out the words." Marcus had been researching Aethon abilities using the bar's limited database access, trying to understand the technical aspects of what Zephyr was attempting. From what he could determine, Griffin neural networks operated on quantum frequencies that allowed near-instantaneous communication across galactic distances. The process required tremendous mental energy and was traditionally performed by multiple individuals working in harmony. "What if we amplified the signal?" Marcus asked. "The station has quantum communication arrays for interstellar banking transfers. If we could access those systems, the risk of detection would be enormous," Zephyr protested. "Such a signal would leave traces that any competent monitoring station could detect." "Let them detect it," Marcus said. "We're past the point of hiding. The question is whether we can get your people here before our enemies figure out how to stop us." Zephyr considered this, golden eyes distant as the Griffin calculated risks and possibilities. "There is another consideration. If I succeed in making contact, if other Aethon agree to come here, they will be abandoning safety for the first time in centuries. Some of them have survived as long as they have precisely because they never take such risks." "But some of them will come anyway?" "Yes," Zephyr said quietly. "Some of them will come. And when they do, we will face the same forces that destroyed our civilization 3 centuries ago." Marcus smiled grimly. "Good thing we're not planning to fight them the same way." The plan they developed over the previous days was unconventional, to say the least. Instead of trying to hide or run from their pursuers, they would use the Drifter's Rest as a focal point for a trap that would draw every interested party to one location. Marcus had been quietly modifying the bar's systems, installing equipment that Zephyr had designed using principles of Aethon technology that human science barely understood. The modifications were subtle but extensive. The bar's hull had been reinforced with crystalline matrices that could channel and focus psychic energy. The ventilation system now included harmonic resonators that would amplify certain mental frequencies. Most importantly, the quantum communication array that Marcus had mentioned wasn't just for sending messages. It was designed to create a psychic beacon that would be visible to any Aethon within a dozen star systems. "When we activate the beacon," Zephyr warned, "there will be no turning back. Every hunter, collector, and government agency in the sector will know exactly where to find us." "That's the idea," Marcus replied. "We draw them all here, to ground we've prepared, with allies they don't know about." Over the past 2 days, Marcus had noticed an increase in certain types of customers. Beings who moved with military precision, who paid for drinks they didn't touch, and who seemed more interested in studying the bar's layout than socializing. They were mercenaries, but not the type who worked for hunters or collectors. These were professionals who specialized in protection services and extraction operations. Marcus had put word out through very specific channels using codes and contacts from his days running cargo for questionable employers. The message was simple: substantial payment for services rendered in defense of persecuted individuals. No questions asked, payment guaranteed regardless of outcome. The response had been better than expected. Mercenaries understood the value of reputation, and a job that involved protecting refugees from government persecution was exactly the kind of work that could enhance a professional standing in certain circles. More importantly, the payment Marcus was offering would come from seized hunter assets, which meant they'd be taking money directly from the people who made their living capturing and enslaving sentient beings. "Your human friends are interesting," Zephyr observed, having noticed the same patterns Marcus had. "They do not feel like typical soldiers for hire." "They're not," Marcus confirmed. "Most of them are former military who got disgusted with government service for one reason or another. They freelance now, but they're picky about their employers." He paused. "Also, I may have mentioned that we're planning to raid several illegal detention facilities and liberate captured Aethon." Zephyr's eyes widened. "You did what?" "Think about it. We draw all the major hunters here. They'll be operating with skeleton crews back at their bases. Perfect time to hit their facilities and free everyone they're holding." Marcus grinned. "Your people won't just be reuniting, they'll be getting revenge." The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Instead of simply trying to protect the few free Aethon, Marcus was proposing to rescue the captured ones as well. It would require precision timing, exceptional intelligence gathering, and probably more luck than they had any right to expect. It was also completely insane. "The detention facilities are heavily defended," Zephyr protested. "Some of them are operated by criminal organizations with private armies. Others are hidden in government black sites with military-grade security systems." "Which is why we're not going in alone," Marcus replied. "I've reached out to some other interested parties. Turns out there are quite a few organizations that would love to see the hunter networks disrupted." Those organizations included several species rights groups, a few reformed criminal syndicates looking to improve their public image, and at least one government agency that preferred to operate without official acknowledgement. The common thread was a shared interest in dismantling the networks that trafficked in sentient beings. Marcus had carefully avoided mentioning the full scope of what they were planning, but he'd provided enough information to generate significant interest. By the time everyone realized what they'd signed up for, they'd be too committed to back out. "This is madness," Zephyr said, but there was something in the Griffin's voice that suggested admiration rather than criticism. "Yeah, probably," Marcus agreed. "But it's the kind of madness that might actually work. Your people spent 3 centuries running and hiding, and where did it get them? Still hunted, still captured, still alone." He met Zephyr's golden gaze. "Maybe it's time to try something different." That night, they activated the beacon. The process required both technological and psychic components working in harmony. Marcus handled the technical aspects, routing power through the modified systems and calibrating the quantum arrays to the frequencies Zephyr specified. The Griffin provided the psychic energy, drawing on reserves of mental strength that had been carefully conserved over centuries of isolation. The beacon's activation was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. The air itself seemed to shimmer with invisible energy, and he could feel something vast and ancient stirring in response to Zephyr's call. For a moment, the Griffin's consciousness expanded beyond the confines of the small storage room, reaching across space and time to touch minds that had been silent for too long. Then the responses began to arrive. They came as whispered thoughts at first, tentative mental touches from Aethon, who couldn't quite believe what they were sensing. Recognition. Hope. Fear. Confusion. One by one, ancient minds that had learned to hide themselves began to emerge from their protective shells of isolation. Zephyr's body trembled with the effort of maintaining contact with so many distant individuals simultaneously. Sweat beaded on the Griffin's golden forehead as conversations began in languages that existed only in thought, conducted at the speed of quantum entanglement across impossible distances. 8, Zephyr gasped, after what felt like hours but had actually been only minutes. 8 confirmed responses. 3 are close enough to arrive within 2 days. The others will take longer. What did you tell them? The truth. That the time for hiding is over. That we have a chance to strike back at those who destroyed our civilization. Zephyr's eyes blazed with an inner fire that Marcus had never seen before. That we have found allies worthy of the ancient bonds of friendship. The beacon continued to pulse its message into the quantum foam that underlied normal space, announcing to anyone with the right equipment that the Griffins were no longer hiding. Within hours, that signal would be detected by monitoring stations throughout the sector. Within days, every hunter, collector, and government agency with an interest in Aethon would be converging on Kepler Station. Marcus looked around his little bar, seeing it with new eyes. In less than a week, this modest establishment on the edge of nowhere would become the center of a conflict that had been building for 3 centuries. The Drifters' Rest would either be the site of the Aethon species' resurrection or the location of their final extinction. No pressure, Marcus muttered to himself, then went to check on the hidden weapon systems he'd been installing while Zephyr wasn't looking. Outside, the first of the mercenary ships was already docking with the station, bringing reinforcements for a battle that most of the galaxy didn't even know was coming. In the depths of space, ancient minds that had learned to live with despair were beginning to remember what it felt like to hope. The hunt for the last free Griffins was about to become something much more significant, the first battle in a war to reclaim everything the Aethon had lost, and to prove that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. Marcus Chen, bartender and amateur revolutionary, was about to discover that humans weren't the only species that refused to give up when everything seemed hopeless. Sometimes it just took the right circumstances to remind even the most ancient peoples that surrender was a choice, not an inevitability. The first of the responding Aethon arrived at dawn on the second day, and Marcus understood immediately why the Griffins had once been considered almost mythical by other species. The being that emerged from the unmarked transport ship moved with a grace that seemed to defy gravity, wings that spanned nearly 30 feet folded against a frame that looked like it had been carved from starlight itself. This Griffin's feathers were silver-white with traces of deep blue, and its presence seemed to make the very air around it shimmer with barely contained energy. "Seraph," Zephyr whispered, rising from behind the bar where they'd been monitoring arrival schedules. "Elder of the Third Circle, keeper of the navigation matrices." The ancient Griffin's eyes, brilliant silver instead of gold, swept the interior of the Drifter's Rest with an expression that managed to convey both curiosity and mild disapproval. When that gaze fell on Marcus, he felt as if every thought he'd ever had was being catalogued and evaluated. "So," Seraph said in a voice like distant thunder, "this is the human who believes he can succeed where the Aethon Confederacy failed." Marcus straightened, meeting those silver eyes directly despite feeling like he was being examined by a force of nature. "I'm the human who thinks running and hiding for 3 centuries hasn't worked out so well. Maybe it's time to try a different approach." Seraph's head tilted in the same bird-like gesture Marcus had noticed in Zephyr, but where the younger Griffin's movements suggested wariness, the elders conveyed calculation. "You propose to fight enemies who command fleets of hunter ships, operate detention facilities in a dozen star systems, and have the resources of multiple governments at their disposal. With what? A converted cargo container and a handful of mercenaries?" "I propose to fight smart instead of fair," Marcus corrected, "and with more than you think." Before Seraph could respond, Marcus's communication system chimed with an incoming message. The display showed a formation of 6 ships approaching the station, flying in a pattern that suggested both escort and defensive positioning. But these weren't hunter vessels. The energy signatures were all wrong, and the ship designs incorporated technologies that most criminal organizations couldn't afford. "Those would be the other interested parties I mentioned," Marcus said, watching, as Seraph's expression shifted from skeptical to intrigued. The ships that docked over the next hour brought representatives from organizations that Marcus had never expected to deal with directly. There was Commander Sarah Chen from the Free Traders Alliance, a loose confederation of merchant ships that had been fighting pirates and slavers for decades. Captain Thane Corver arrived representing the Epsilon Mercenary Guild, which specialized in operations that governments couldn't officially acknowledge. Most surprising was the presence of Director Lynn Vasquez from the Colonial Rights Commission, a quasi-governmental body that investigated abuses of protected species legislation. All of them wanted the same thing: an end to the hunter networks that have been operating with impunity for too long. "The Commission has been trying to build cases against major collectors for years," Director Vasquez explained, as they gathered in the bar's back room for an impromptu planning session. "Problem is, they're careful about jurisdiction, and they have enough political connections to make prosecution difficult. But if we could catch them in the act of abducting protected species, or if we could document the conditions in their detention facilities," Commander Chen added. "The Free Traders Alliance has lost too many ships to hunters who operate under the cover of legitimate salvage operations. We'd very much like to return the favor." Captain Corver was more direct. "My people have personal grudges against several of the major hunter clans. They've been taking contracts that involve sentient trafficking, which violates every mercenary code worth mentioning. We volunteer for this operation pro bono." Marcus found himself staring at a room full of beings who had independently reached the same conclusion he had. The hunter networks had grown too powerful and too arrogant, and it was time to remind them that their prey might fight back. The fact that they were willing to risk their careers and organizations to do it suggested that the situation was worse than he'd realized. "How many detention facilities are we talking about?" Marcus asked. Director Vasquez activated a holographic display that showed star charts for the local sector. Red markers appeared at 17 different locations. These are confirmed sites where captured Aethon are being held. There are probably more that we haven't identified yet. Seraph studied the display with an expression that was equal parts grief and rage. 17 facilities, each potentially holding dozens of my people. The ancient Griffin's voice dropped to a whisper. "We estimated that perhaps 50 Aethon remained in captivity. If these numbers are accurate, conservative estimate is 200, Vasquez said quietly. "Possibly more." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. What they'd been thinking of as a rescue operation for a handful of individuals was actually a potential liberation of hundreds. The scope was staggering, but so were the risks. "We can't hit 17 targets simultaneously," Commander Chen pointed out. "Even if we had the resources, which we don't, the logistics would be impossible to coordinate." "We don't need to hit them all at once," Marcus replied. "We just need to hit the right ones at the right time." Over the next several hours, they developed a strategy that was complex, dangerous, and completely unprecedented. Instead of trying to liberate every Aethon in captivity, they would focus on 3 specific targets: the facilities that held the largest numbers of prisoners, the most strategically important captives, and the detention centers owned by the most politically vulnerable organizations. While the bulk of the hunter fleets converged on Kepler Station in response to Zephyr's beacon, strike teams would hit the 3 priority targets. The liberated Aethon would then be transported to predetermined safe zones where they could begin the process of cultural restoration that Zephyr had described. Meanwhile, at Kepler Station itself, they would prepare for the confrontation that everyone knew was coming. The hunters wouldn't be content with simply retrieving Zephyr. They'd want to send a message that would discourage any future resistance. That meant they'd come in force, with enough firepower to level the entire station if necessary. "The key is making them commit fully," Captain Corver explained. "If they think this is just another refugee hiding in a bar, they'll send a small team. But if they believe we represent a genuine threat to their operations, they'll bring everything they have." "And then?" Seraph asked. Marcus smiled. "And then we spring our real surprise." The real surprise was currently being assembled in the station's main cargo bay, hidden beneath the cover of routine maintenance work. It looked like a standard communication array, the type used for interstellar banking transfers and emergency broadcasts. What it actually was would have surprised even the beings who'd helped design it. Marcus had spent years in the cargo hauling business, which meant he'd learned things about technology that weren't covered in any standard engineering manuals. When you needed to move freight through systems controlled by hostile governments or aggressive pirates, you learned to be creative with your ship's capabilities. Some of those lessons applied to space stations as well. The device they were building was part communication array, part defensive system, and part weapon. When activated, it would broadcast Aethon navigation frequencies on every quantum channel simultaneously, creating a psychic beacon visible from anywhere in the galaxy. But those same frequencies, properly amplified and focused, could also disrupt the neural interfaces that many hunter ships used for targeting and navigation. More importantly, the beacon would serve as a rallying point for every free Aethon in known space. Zephyr's original message had reached 8 individuals, but the enhanced signal would be detectable by hundreds more, Griffins who had been hiding so successfully that they'd forgotten they weren't the only ones left. "This is not merely about survival," Seraph said, as they watched technicians install the final components. "You are proposing to awaken something that has been dormant for centuries, the collective consciousness of the Aethon people. Is that a problem?" Marcus asked. "I am not certain. When the great Ares fell, when our people were scattered across the galaxy, the neural networks that connected us were severed. What you are proposing could reestablish those connections, but the trauma of reconnection after so much isolation..." Seraph paused. "It could be overwhelming." Zephyr, who had been monitoring the technical preparations, looked up from a bank of control panels. "Or it could be exactly what we need. Our people have been alone for too long. Perhaps it is time for them to remember what it means to be Aethon." The debate was interrupted by an alert from the station's traffic control system. Marcus checked the display and felt his stomach tighten. 12 ships had just emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system, flying in a formation that suggested military-level coordination. Their energy signatures matched known hunter vessel configurations. "Looks like word of our little gathering has reached the right people," Marcus observed. Commander Chen was already coordinating with her ships, preparing defensive positions around the station. Captain Corver's mercenaries were taking up positions throughout the station's corridors, turning every intersection into a potential choke point. Director Vasquez was documenting everything for the legal cases she planned to build from the evidence they were about to gather, but it was Seraph's reaction that caught Marcus's attention. The ancient Griffin stood perfectly still, wings spread slightly as if testing air currents, and those silver eyes had taken on a quality that made the lighting in the room seem suddenly brighter. "There are others," Seraph said quietly. "I can sense them approaching. Not hunters, Aethon. More than I have felt in one place for 3 centuries. Over the next several hours they arrived in ones and twos, sometimes in small groups. Each Griffin was different. Some bore the scars of long captivity followed by escape. Others showed the careful camouflage that came from centuries of hiding among other species. Their feathers ranged from deep gold like Zephyr's to pure silver like Seraph's, with variations that included rich blues, deep greens, and colors that Marcus didn't have names for. By the time the hunter fleet reached the station's outer perimeter, there were 23 Aethon gathered in the Drifter's Rest. It was the largest concentration of free griffins anywhere in the galaxy, and their combined presence was creating effects that none of them had anticipated. The air itself seemed different, charged with an energy that made Marcus's hair stand on end. The griffins moved in unconscious coordination, as if responding to signals that other species couldn't detect. When they spoke, their voices harmonized in ways that suggested they were sharing thoughts as well as words. "The neural networks are re-establishing themselves," Zephyr explained, voice filled with wonder. "I can feel memories that are not mine, knowledge that was lost when the elders were captured. We are becoming whole again." But wholeness came with a price. As the psychic connections between the Aethon grew stronger, so did their awareness of their people still in captivity. Marcus could see the effect on their faces, the growing anguish as they sensed the suffering of hundreds of their kind held in detention facilities across the galaxy. "We have to free them," one of the newly arrived griffins said, voice tight with emotion. "We cannot leave them in those places now that we know they are there." "We will," Seraph replied. "But first, we must deal with those who come to reclaim us." The hunter fleet had established a blockade around the station, but they hadn't yet made any aggressive moves. Marcus suspected they were trying to figure out exactly what they were dealing with. The energy signatures coming from the station would be unlike anything in their experience. Clearly Aethon in origin, but amplified far beyond what a single griffin should be capable of generating. "They're scared," Marcus realized. "They've never had to deal with organized resistance before. Individual griffins they can handle, but this many working together? They're out of their depth." "Good," Seraph said, and there was something in the ancient griffin's voice that reminded Marcus why the Aethon had once been rulers of star systems. "It is time they learned what it means to face prey that fights back." The communication array they'd built was nearly ready for activation. When it came online, it would announce to the entire galaxy that the Aethon were no longer hiding, no longer running, and no longer alone. Every hunter, collector, and government agency that had participated in their persecution would have to make a choice: retreat or face the consequences of 3 centuries of accumulated justice. Marcus looked around his bar, seeing it crowded with beings whose existence he'd never imagined a week earlier. 23 griffins, each one a living repository of ancient knowledge and accumulated wisdom. Their presence had transformed his modest establishment into something that felt like a temple or a royal court. Soon, it would become a battlefield. "Are you ready for this?" he asked Zephyr, who was making final adjustments to the beacon controls. The golden-eyed griffin looked up, and Marcus saw in that gaze a determination that had been tempered by centuries of hardship but never broken. "We have been ready for 300 years, Zephyr replied. "We simply needed someone to remind us that hiding and survival are not the same thing." Outside, the hunter ships waited with the patience of predators who believed their prey had nowhere to run. They were about to discover that they had made a fundamental error in calculation. The Aethon hadn't been hiding because they were weak. They'd been hiding because they were outnumbered. That was about to change. The beacon powered up with a harmonic resonance that seemed to make the station itself sing, and across the galaxy, every remaining Aethon heard the call to come home. The age of running was over. The age of reclamation had begun. And in a converted cargo container that served drinks to the desperate and weary, the last free members of an ancient race prepared to remind the galaxy why their people had once been legends. The beacon's activation sent ripples through hyperspace that were felt across half the galaxy, but its most immediate effect was on the hunter fleet surrounding Kepler Station. Marcus watched their tactical displays fluctuate wildly as the Aethon frequency disrupted their targeting systems and navigation computers. Ships that had maintained perfect formation suddenly found themselves drifting out of position. their crews struggling with equipment that was no longer responding properly. "First lesson in fighting Griffins," Seraph observed with grim satisfaction. "Most modern technology relies on quantum processing systems that are vulnerable to psychic interference. The hunters have forgotten that their prey once commanded energies they barely understand." The communication system crackled to life, broadcasting an angry voice from the fleet commander. "Kepler Station, this is Commodore Vex of the Crimson Fleet. You are harboring stolen property in violation of Galactic Salvage Code 779. Surrender the specimens immediately or face the consequences." Marcus looked around the room at 23 beings who had just been referred to as specimens and stolen property. The collective expression on their faces was not encouraging for anyone who valued their continued health. "Zephyr, would you like to respond to that?" Marcus asked, offering the communication microphone. The golden-eyed Griffin accepted the device with a smile that showed rather more teeth than Marcus had previously noticed. "Commodore Vex, this is Zephyr of the Stellar Winds, speaking for the free Aethon of Kepler Station. We are not property, stolen or otherwise. We are sentient beings exercising our fundamental right to exist without persecution." There was a pause as Zephyr's voice took on harmonics that seemed to resonate through the station's hull. "You have 30 minutes to withdraw from this system. After that, we will consider your presence an act of war. You're in no position to make demands, specimen. We have 12 ships with enough firepower to crack that station open like an egg." 12 ships, Seraph mused, rising from where the ancient Griffin had been monitoring the sensor displays. How quaint. The elder Aethon moved to the center of the room, and the other Griffins began to form a circle around their senior member. "It has been quite some time since I've had the opportunity to demonstrate why the ancient courts feared Aethon battle formations." Marcus found himself backing toward the wall as the temperature in the room began to rise. The Griffins were linking their consciousness again, but this time the purpose was clearly not communication. Energy was building between them, visible as a golden glow that seemed to emanate from their feathers and gather in the space above their heads. "What exactly are you planning to do?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady as the hair on his arms stood up from static discharge. "Something that has not been attempted in over 3 centuries, Zephyr replied without breaking concentration. "A unified stellar wind manifestation. Our ancestors used such techniques to propel their ships between galaxies without technological assistance." Marcus was beginning to understand why the Aethon had been considered almost mythical by other species. What he was witnessing looked less like advanced technology and more like controlled magic. The energy building in the room was taking on structure, forming patterns that reminded him of solar wind simulations he'd seen in astrophysics documentaries. The Hunter fleet chose that moment to open fire. Marcus felt the station shudder as energy beams struck the outer hull, but the damage was far less than it should have been. The station's shields, never particularly impressive under normal circumstances, were somehow holding against military-grade weaponry. Then he realized why. The energy field surrounding the Griffins had extended outward, enveloping the entire station in a protective barrier that made incoming weapons fire look like rain hitting a window. "Impressive," Seraph said conversationally, as if weapons capable of destroying small cities weren't currently being fired at them, but ultimately ineffective. "Shall we respond in kind?" The ancient Griffin raised one hand, and Marcus watched in fascination as the energy patterns above their circle began to coalesce into something that looked disturbingly like a miniature star. The temperature in the room spiked dramatically, and Marcus was grateful for the environmental systems that kept the atmosphere from becoming lethally hot. "Target the lead vessel," Seraph instructed. "Desirable, not destroy. We want prisoners for questioning, not martyrs for their cause." The miniature star suddenly expanded, flowing through the station's hull as if solid matter was merely a suggestion. Marcus ran to the observation window and watched as a beam of coherent energy, brilliant as a solar flare, reached across space to strike the Hunter fleet's flagship. The ship's shields flared and failed instantly, and secondary systems began exploding in cascade failures that left the vessel dark and powerless. "One down," Zephyr observed. 11 to go. But the remaining Hunter ships were already retreating, their commanders apparently deciding that whatever bounty they'd been promised wasn't worth facing weapons that could disable a heavy cruiser with a single shot. Marcus watched them flee toward the edge of the system, probably heading for hyperspace jump points that would take them back to whoever had hired them. "Should we pursue?" one of the younger Griffins asked. "No," Seraph replied. "Let them carry word of what they've seen. The Hunter fleets have operated with impunity for too long because they believed their prey was helpless. It's time the galaxy learned otherwise." The immediate threat dealt with, Marcus turned his attention to the communication array that was still broadcasting the beacon signal. In the few hours since activation, they'd received over 200 responses from Aethon across the galaxy. Some were individuals like those already gathered at the station, solitary survivors who had been hiding for decades or centuries. Others were more disturbing, groups of captives who had somehow gained access to communication systems in detention facilities. "The strike teams are reporting in," Commander Chen announced, monitoring communications from the simultaneous operations they'd launched against Hunter facilities. "Initial objectives achieved at all 3 targets. Estimated 47 Aethon liberated so far, with more being processed." Those numbers represented more free Griffins than had existed in any one place since the fall of Aethon Prime, but Marcus could see on the faces around him that it wasn't enough. The psychic network linking the gathered Aethon was providing them with an increasingly clear picture of their people's situation across the galaxy, and that picture was heartbreaking. "There are so many," Zephyr whispered, golden eyes bright with unshed tears. "Hundreds of our people held in facilities we never knew existed. Some have been captive for so long they no longer remember their true names." Marcus understood the dilemma they were facing. The beacon had accomplished its primary purpose of gathering the free Aethon and demonstrating that they could defend themselves when united. But it had also revealed the true scope of their people's suffering, creating a moral obligation that none of them could ignore. "We can't save them all at once," Marcus said gently, "but we can save them eventually if we're smart about it." "How?" Seraph asked. "The facilities that remain are the most heavily defended ones, operated by organizations with substantial military resources. Even with our abilities fully manifested, 23 Aethon cannot assault fortified positions across multiple star systems." Marcus had been thinking about this problem since the first strike team reports had come in. The solution, when it occurred to him, was both simple and completely insane. "We don't assault anything," he said. "We make them come to us." The plan he outlined was based on a fundamental truth about criminal organizations. They were businesses, and businesses had to protect their assets. If those assets started disappearing in large numbers, the people responsible would eventually take drastic action to stop the losses. "We keep hitting facilities," Marcus explained. "Not all at once, but systematically. Each liberation operation makes the remaining facilities more valuable and more heavily defended. Eventually, the hunters will have no choice but to consolidate their prisoners in a few heavily fortified locations. Creating larger targets," Commander Chen said, following his logic, "but also harder ones. Not necessarily. Larger concentrations of Aethon means stronger psychic resonance. If we can get close enough to one of these consolidated facilities, a neural cascade," Seraph breathed, understanding immediately. "With enough of our people in close proximity, the psychic feedback would be unprecedented. We could potentially disable the facility's systems from the inside." It was a high-risk strategy that would require perfect timing and coordination, but it offered something that no amount of conventional military action could achieve: the possibility of liberating every remaining Aethon simultaneously. Over the next several days, they put the plan into motion. Strike teams hit Hunter facilities with surgical precision, always targeting locations where the defenses were weakest and the number of captives was highest. Each successful operation brought more free Aethon to Kepler Station, where they added their abilities to the growing psychic network. The station itself was transforming. What had started as a minor frontier outpost was becoming something unprecedented in galactic history, the capital of a resurrected civilization. The Aethon were sharing their accumulated knowledge, rebuilding cultural traditions that had been nearly lost, and preparing for a final confrontation that would determine their people's fate. Marcus found himself serving as an unofficial coordinator between the various species involved in the operation. It was strange to realize that his little bar had become the headquarters for what amounted to an interstellar war, but stranger things had happened in his life. Besides, someone had to keep track of all the moving pieces, and he was probably the only being present who didn't have psychic abilities that might interfere with electronic systems. The end, when it came, arrived faster than anyone expected. "Massive fleet movement in the Vega system," Director Vasquez reported, monitoring intelligence feeds from her organization's sources. "Looks like every major hunter clan has committed their primary assets to a joint operation. Best estimate is over 200 ships, including at least a dozen heavy cruisers." Marcus felt his blood run cold. "Target?" "Unknown, but they're loading specialized containment equipment, the kind used for large-scale prisoner transport." The implications were obvious. The hunters had decided that the systematic liberation of their assets posed an unacceptable threat to their business model. Instead of allowing the Ethon to continue their rescue operations, they were consolidating every captive Griffin in the galaxy for transport to a single, impregnable location. Where? Seraph asked, the ancient Griffin's voice tight with controlled fury. Coordinates are coming in now, Vasquez replied, then paled as she read the display. It's Tartarus Station, maximum security detention facility in the Void Nebula. No permanent population, no civilian traffic, and defenses designed to withstand siege by a battle fleet. Marcus had heard of Tartarus Station. It was where the galaxy's most dangerous criminals were sent when conventional prisons weren't sufficient. The facility was built into an asteroid in the center of a nebula that interfered with most forms of communication and navigation. Getting there required specialized equipment and knowledge of safe passage routes that were closely guarded secrets. It was, in other words, the perfect place to hold prisoners you never intended to release. How many Aethon? Marcus asked quietly. Vasquez,